In the land of powdered wigs and palace walls, the British royal family has buried more than just secrets. These are the stories they definitely don't teach in school. Ghostly carriages, cursed romances, royal underpants, and a queen who ruled with Tupperware. Forget the crown jewels. These are the truly bizarre, barely believable tales from behind the throne. Because when your family tree goes back 1,000 years, things are bound to get weird. This is 33 bizarre British royal stories that were totally true. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed, especially if you like your history a little weird and wildly off script. Drop us a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And just for fun, what time is it right now where you are? Midnight scroll? Lunch break escape? We want to know. All right, on to the madness. 1. Queen Elizabeth I's lead makeup. There are few faces in history more instantly recognizable. Powdered to a ghostly pale, with high razor-sharp hairlines and lips that look like two blood-red commas. But beneath the signature look of Queen Elizabeth, was a secret more sinister than any political intrigue. She was slowly killing herself, and doing it in the name of beauty. The face paint she used was called Venetian ceruse, a cosmetic made from a delightful mixture of vinegar and white lead. Yes, lead, the heavy metal, the one they tell you not to lick, inhale, or touch without gloves in modern hazmat guides. In the 1500s, it was slathered on cheeks and foreheads like frosting. The result was a perfectly pale face, unmarred by the sun, age, or nature, which, in the paranoid world of Tudor politics, was the point. Pale skin was everything. It meant nobility, leisure. The opposite of the poor farmers and workers who got tans from laboring under the sun like, well, peasants. A face white as paper said, you didn't toil, you reigned. But for Elizabeth, the commitment to that illusion became an obsession, and then a mask she couldn't remove. When she contracted smallpox in 1562, she barely survived. The illness left her scarred, and suddenly, the already unhealthy white paint took on a new function, hiding the imperfections, hiding the fact that she was human, hiding the mortality of a queen who needed to seem divine. So she layered it thicker. With each year, the mask grew heavier. The lead seeped into her skin. It cracked her complexion, caused hair loss, blackened her teeth. Ironically, the very thing she used to remain beautiful made her monstrous. But no one dared tell her. You don't give skincare advice to the Virgin Queen. The irony didn't end there. Venetian ceruse was so toxic that it burned the skin it touched. So, to hide the burns from the lead, women, including Elizabeth, would apply more of it. A cycle of damage and cover-up, like trying to fix a rotting wall with fresh wallpaper. The cracks always came back. Some historians speculate that her declining health later in life, the fatigue, the insomnia, the strange moods, might have been symptoms of lead poisoning. Others suggest it wasn't just the face paint, but the lead-laced rouges, lip color, and powders. Her entire beauty regimen was basically a toxicology report waiting to happen. But in court, she was untouchable, literally and politically. By the time she died in 1603, she was nearly bald beneath the wigs, her teeth black, her fingers trembling. She reportedly refused to have mirrors in her chambers toward the end. Whether that was out of vanity or fear of what she'd see, no one knows. And yet, for centuries, that ghostly image of her, pale, powerful, staring down the world, became iconic. As if death itself had put on rouge and declared war on nature. Of course, Elizabeth I wasn't the only monarch who dabbled in strange chemistry. But while she poisoned herself slowly, another royal's body betrayed him in a much more colorful way. 2. King George III's blue pea. Let's set the scene. It's the late 1700s, and the most powerful man in Britain, the king himself, is talking to a tree. Not metaphorically, not spiritually. He is speaking to it quite literally, addressing it as if it were the King of Prussia. A polite nod, some diplomatic language, and full regalia. The royal advisors, of course, pretend not to notice. You know how it is. Monarchs can be eccentric, or in this case, dangerously unwell. King George III's so-called madness has become the stuff of legend, reinterpreted over the centuries as tragedy, satire, or some twisted Shakespearean character study. But behind the powdered wigs and whispered rumors was a much stranger detail that got buried in footnotes. His urine turned blue. Yes, blue. The diagnosis? Possibly porphyria, a rare and inherited metabolic disorder that messes with how the body produces heme, a crucial component of hemoglobin. Porphyria can cause a host of symptoms, most famously bouts of severe mental confusion, paranoia, hallucinations, sensitivity to sunlight, and, depending on the type, a charming blue or purple tinge to bodily fluids, like an accidental Renaissance version of Gatorade. The doctors of the time didn't understand any of this, of course. They were baffled, which wasn't unusual for the 18th century. Most treatments still involve bloodletting, leeches, and occasionally just hoping the patient died quietly. But the blue pea, formerly referred to as blue discoloration of the urine in the more dignified medical notes, became a recurring point of fascination. Was it porphyria? Was it a reaction to the bucket load of medicine they gave him? One theory suggested the coloring might have come from a particular plant-based medicine used to calm his nerves, which may have had an indigo-like effect on his urine. Others argued it was psychosomatic nonsense, cooked up by royalists or Republicans depending on which side of the throne you stood. But here's the kicker. George III wasn't just losing touch with reality. He was still, technically, running an empire. During his episodes, he would write letters for hours, sometimes raving, sometimes brilliant, always intense. Pages and pages of royal handwriting looping into manic spirals of thought. He once wrote 400 words in a single sentence, which is impressive whether you're a monarch or just really into caffeine. Even stranger. During his lucid periods, he remembered much of what he had said or done while unwell. Imagine the horror of waking up from a months-long fever dream only to recall in perfect detail the time you knighted an oak tree or tried to hold a political debate with a butler's dog. No wonder the court grew increasingly anxious. The line between royal eccentricity and mental collapse was razor thin, and Britain didn't like being reminded that its kings were human, fallible, and in this case, oddly hued. The image of blue urine became symbolic, a literal leak in the machinery of monarchy. Something private and unseen, suddenly undeniable. An empire may paint its rulers in gold and ermine, but underneath, just another body falling apart in real time. By the end of his life, George III was completely blind, frequently incoherent, and largely hidden from public view. He became a ghost in his own palace, kept alive by courtiers who preferred silence to scandal. But while George quietly unraveled in private, another royal, a century and a half later, chose a more flamboyant route. She faced her own demons with pearls, gin, and a bathtub full of mischief. 2 stories in and we've already hit lead poisoning and royal blue pea. And trust us, it only gets stranger from here. If you're still with us, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a descent into royal weirdness. And hey, where are you tuning in from? What time is it right now where you are? Are you listening in bed? On a train? Hiding from your boss? Let us know in the comments. We're mildly obsessed with time zones. 3. Princess Margaret's bathtub. Gin. If Queen Elizabeth was the composed face of monarchy, steely, dutiful, poker-faced for 7 decades straight, Her younger sister, Princess Margaret, was the royal id, the wild card, the spark plug, the one who smoked too much, drank too much, flirted with photographers, and once turned down a king because she liked her freedom more than his crown. And nowhere was her legendary excess more distilled, literally, than in her morning routine, a schedule that reportedly began not with tea or toast, but with a bathtub and a stiff gin and tonic. Margaret's daily rituals have passed into lore. According to her one-time staff and a few carefully placed biographies, her mornings didn't begin until around 11 a.m., when she would rise from her royal sheets and glide toward her first audience of the day, the mirror. There, she would smoke a cigarette while having her hair styled to perfection, a gravity-defying bouffant that seemed to challenge physics and responsibility in equal measure. Then came the bath. Not a hurried shower, not a soak, a ceremony. The Princess of Leisure, waist-deep in a tub, surrounded by crystal bottles, scented oils, and, most notably, a gin and tonic with just the right ratio of fizz to rebellion. The clink of ice cubes, the scent of citrus, the low hum of a radio playing jazz or swing. It was a royal performance staged for no one. Just the echo of aristocratic defiance. Margaret didn't merely drink. She curated her alcohol. There were rules. Champagne before dinner. Wine at dinner. Brandy or scotch after dinner. And gin, often and always, at the edges. It was never about the volume. It was about the aesthetic. She was the kind of person who brought her own glassware on holiday, in case the resort's tumblers weren't up to standard. And yet, the bathtub gin story, true or embellished, speaks to something deeper than indulgence. It was Margaret's armor, her rebellion against the box she was born into. The spare, always a half step behind the crown, forever living in the shadow of a sister who ruled an empire. Margaret couldn't be queen, but she could be cool. She could be mythic. She could turn every private moment into an act of aristocratic performance art. Of course, the press loved it, when they weren't sharpening their knives. Headlines called her scandalous, spoiled, a royal train wreck. But it never seemed to faze her. At parties, she was sharp-tongued and dazzling. At home, she reportedly wore a tiara while vacuuming. If the monarchy was a theater, Margaret was both the diva and the understudy who knew she'd never take center stage, so she set fire to the curtains instead. And behind the laughter, the cocktails, the diamonds, and the smoke was something hard to name, a melancholic grace. A quiet knowledge that she was born into a gilded role with no script. So, she wrote her own. In the end, Margaret's greatest act wasn't rebellion. It was style as survival, a form of resistance wrapped in mink and set to music. But if Margaret used glamour to bend the world, another royal tried something even more bizarre. He believed his touch could heal it. 4. Charles II's royal touch. If you lived in 17th century England and found yourself cursed with a swollen neck, unsightly abscesses, and the creeping suspicion that God had abandoned you, you might have turned, not to a doctor, but to the king himself. Specifically, King Charles II, who believed he had something better than medicine, scripture, or logic. The divine power of healing by touch. That's right. The royal touch. The belief that the King of England, by virtue of crown, blood, and presumably divine Wi-Fi, could cure disease with his bare hands. The specific target of this miraculous ability was scrofula, a form of tuberculosis that attacks the lymph nodes and was, at the time, incurable. In the 1600s, it was also known as the king's evil, because clearly, if your glands were swollen, the best solution was to get slapped by a monarch. Gently, of course. Charles II didn't invent this ritual. It went back centuries, a political sleight of hand dressed as a miracle. But he embraced it like a man trying to heal more than just his people. After all, Charles wasn't just any king. He was the comeback king, returning from exile after the English Civil War and the execution of his father, Charles I. He knew the monarchy needed some divine PR. So what better way to remind people that kings weren't just men in wigs, but vessels of holy power? And so the ceremonies began. They were grand affairs. Subjects lined up in long, weary queues, many of them peasants who had walked for days, some nearly collapsing under the weight of disease and desperation. They came for a miracle. What they got was a brush with velvet and a coin, the so-called touch piece, stamped with the image of St. Michael slaying a dragon, a sort of medieval prescription token, except you couldn't exchange it for antibiotics. You kept it. You prayed. And if your symptoms disappeared, well, proof the king was chosen by God. If not, well, maybe you weren't faithful enough. Charles reportedly touched over 90,000 people during his reign. That's not a typo. 90,000. Picture it. A king in lace cuffs, patiently laying hands on neck after neck, like a one-man faith-healing assembly line. Sometimes he'd even say a prayer. Other times, just a practiced, weary smile. Historians have pointed out that Charles didn't particularly enjoy the ritual, but he did it with theatrical consistency, because optics mattered more than efficacy. Did it work? Probably not. But some claimed it did. Spontaneous remissions, placebo effects, wishful thinking, the usual suspects. But in a kingdom still recovering from regicide, plague, fire, and political chaos, the idea that the king could literally reach out and fix things was deeply comforting. Healing, even if only symbolically, was a kind of national therapy. And that's where the true power of the royal touch lay. Belief. Not in science, not in medicine, but in monarchy, in hierarchy, in the idea that your sovereign could reach across the gap between heaven and earth and remove your suffering with a single, delicate graze. Of course, history would eventually prove that monarchs are rarely miracle workers, but the need to believe that someone above you has the answer never really went away. And as medicine began creeping forward with its slow, brutal logic, another queen would defy it entirely by choosing to be knocked out cold during childbirth. 5. Queen Victoria's chloroform births. In the smoky drawing rooms of 19th century Britain, where ladies fainted at the word legs, and the medical profession still debated whether women should feel pain as a moral duty, Queen Victoria made a decision so shocking, so utterly scandalous, it caused the clergy to shudder, the doctors to argue, and polite society to whisper behind lace fans for decades. She chose chloroform. Not to escape royal life, though some might have understood that. No, she chose to be anesthetized during childbirth. Twice. Let's rewind. In 1853, the Queen was pregnant with her 8th child. By then, she was intimately familiar with the excruciating process of labor. The royal birth chambers may have been gilded and staffed with the best physicians the empire could afford, but there was one thing they could not, or would not, offer: relief. Not because they lacked the tools, but because they lacked the will. Pain, you see, was believed to be sacred, especially in childbirth. After all, wasn't it written in Genesis? In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children. Doctors were nervous. Priests were apoplectic. Anesthetics had been invented, yes. Chloroform had been used in surgeries for years, but not for women in labor. Giving birth without pain was seen as unnatural, heretical even. It tampered with the divine plan. Women were supposed to suffer, silently and nobly, as a mark of moral virtue. Queen Victoria, however, did not share this enthusiasm for spiritual agony. Enter Dr. John Snow, not the one from the Night's Watch, but the pioneering anesthetist who convinced the Queen's inner circle that using chloroform could be safe, effective, and more importantly, discreet. There were risks, of course. The dosage had to be exact. The public reaction could be vicious. But Victoria was no stranger to pushing boundaries quietly, especially when it came to her body. So when the time came to deliver Prince Leopold, she inhaled the vapor-soaked handkerchief, drifted into a painless haze, and woke up having given birth without screaming. And just like that, a centuries-old taboo began to crack. Of course, the newspapers couldn't say much. Royal births were shrouded in secrecy. But word got out. Rumors swirled. The Queen had embraced the devil's vapor. Or perhaps she had embraced something far more terrifying to the establishment: modernity. She did it again in 1857 for her 9th child, Princess Beatrice. This time with more confidence. She called the experience soothing, quieting, delightful beyond measure. Her words rippled through the medical world like a cannon shot. If the Queen could have a painless birth, then why not everyone else? Suddenly, women began demanding access to chloroform. The clergy's sermons didn't stand a chance against the testimony of a monarch who had suffered enough to say no more. Victoria's decision didn't just change childbirth. It changed the conversation about female pain, about control, about science. She may have ruled an empire, but for a brief moment, she led a rebellion. Lying down, eyes closed, floating just above the agony her ancestors had accepted without question. And yet, for all her modern sensibilities, Victoria remained a queen of contradictions. She embraced anesthesia, but despised women's rights movements. She feared change even as she birthed it. Still, her choice marked a turning point. The age of mysticism was giving way to the age of medicine, slowly, cautiously, and not without protest. But while Victoria let science take the wheel, one royal decades later looked to the skies, not for medical breakthroughs, but for visitors. 6. Prince Philip's UFO obsession. He was the Queen's consort, the Duke of Edinburgh, a man known for his stiff upper lip and even stiffer opinions. Prince Philip could command a room, crash a Land Rover, or insult a foreign dignitary, all without breaking stride. But behind the military medals, the brash remarks, and the aura of crusty aristocratic certainty, he harbored a secret fascination that felt more like a late-night radio confession than a royal pastime. He was obsessed with UFOs, not passively, not in a read an article once sort of way. No, Prince Philip was genuinely, actively, and for many years deeply interested in extraterrestrial life. He kept books on the subject. He reportedly subscribed to flying saucer magazines. And during the peak of Britain's post-war UFO frenzy, think glowing lights over RAF bases, entire villages claiming close encounters, the Duke was paying close attention. It wasn't just the spectacle that intrigued him. According to declassified documents and accounts from those in the know, Philip requested to receive all Ministry of Defense reports on UFO sightings. He wanted the briefings. He wanted the details. A field marshal by rank, he approached the matter like a military investigation. Methodical, curious, and a little bit skeptical, but not dismissive. The obsession is often traced back to Lord Louis Mountbatten, his uncle, mentor, and fellow naval officer, who had a strong interest in unexplained aerial phenomena himself. Mountbatten once filed a report describing a strange encounter on his estate in 1955 involving a mysterious object hovering above the ground and a terrified groundsman who claimed to see a being emerge from it. Instead of laughing it off, Mountbatten documented it in proper bureaucratic detail and passed it along. Philip read the report. He did not laugh either. The Duke's curiosity wasn't just academic. In private, he invited UFO enthusiasts, researchers, and even alleged abductees to Buckingham Palace for tea and conversation. One guest recalled being ushered into a sitting room and spending hours discussing propulsion systems, radar anomalies, and the likelihood that governments knew more than they were saying, all while being served scones by the staff. And let's be clear, this wasn't some lonely elderly man staring at the stars in retirement. Philip's interests spanned decades. It existed alongside his royal duties, his patronages, his infamous faux pas. The same man who once told a group of students that they were too stupid to get jobs was also collecting correspondence from pilots who claimed to have chased flying discs. What made this all the more surreal was the contrast. A man born into one of Earth's most entrenched hierarchies, peering upward toward the ultimate unknown. Here was a royal surrounded by palaces, tradition, and protocol, spending his free time pondering the unseeable and unprovable. The crown, it seemed, couldn't quite contain his curiosity. He never claimed to see one himself, at least not publicly. But he seemed to want to believe, or at least to be prepared should belief become unavoidable. Perhaps it was the military man in him, scanning the skies for threats. Or maybe it was something more personal, the yearning, tucked away in a life of ceremony, for the kind of mystery that can't be solved with a formal dinner or a press release. And so, even as the public saw him as the Queen's gruff shadow, Philip kept his eyes trained on the strange and unexplained. He couldn't say for sure what was out there, but he knew something was. Or at the very least, something might be. Of course, while Philip was theorizing about visitors from beyond the stars, one of his royal predecessors preferred to focus on a different kind of indulgence, something far more terrestrial, primal, and aggressively carnivorous. 7. Henry VIII's giant turkey legs. When you imagine King Henry VIII, you don't picture a subtle man. This was a monarch who rebranded an entire country's religion just so he could ditch his first wife. A man who married 6 times, beheaded 2 of those wives, and once declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England while likely wearing a feathered hat the size of a small heron. And yet, for all the political earthquakes he triggered, he's still remembered best for one thing: those giant turkey legs. You've seen the image, whether in portraits, pop culture parodies, or Renaissance fair caricatures. Henry VIII, throne-bound, eyes glazed with authority, gripping a roasted drumstick the size of a club. There's grease on his fingers, maybe a goblet in the other hand, and the sense that if you asked him to share, you'd be promptly excommunicated. And as with most iconic images, it's only partly true. Turkey, for starters, wasn't even widely available in England until the 1520s. Before that, it was strictly for the elite. Imported from the Americas, turkeys were expensive, exotic, and utterly impractical. Perfect, in other words, for royal dining. So while Henry might not have been raised on turkey legs, once they arrived, he made them a centerpiece. Not because they were delicious, though they were, but because they were loud food. Food that said, "I am rich enough to eat like a lion and leave half of it behind." Contemporary accounts of his banquets are staggering. Dozens of dishes per course. Exotic birds, entire boars, pies stuffed with smaller pies. And yes, roasted fowl served whole, seasoned with spices looted from half the known world. Henry didn't just eat to survive, he ate to perform. Every bite was propaganda. Every chew, a declaration. I am strong. I am unstoppable. I am divine. Also, bring more gravy. This wasn't just culinary theater. It was personal branding. Henry had once been a lean, athletic king, a skilled jouster, musician, even something of a Renaissance heartthrob. But after a jousting accident in 1536 left his leg permanently injured, everything changed. He could no longer exercise. His mood soured. His waistline expanded, rapidly. So he leaned into the image that people feared and worshipped. The glutton king, whose appetite was as insatiable as his ego. The turkey leg, greasy, primal, vaguely medieval, became the shorthand for all of it. Never mind that portraits of Henry don't actually show him holding one. The symbolism stuck. Today, it's practically a meme. Henry VIII, devourer of wives and poultry alike. But the irony is this. By the end of his life, food was no longer a pleasure. It was a burden. His health deteriorated. His mobility was limited. His meals had to be adjusted, though no one dared tell him to slow down. The court doctors, after all, were more afraid of his temper than of gout. So the man who once weaponized banquets as a display of dominance eventually found himself imprisoned by his own appetites, surrounded by opulence but increasingly isolated. A throne built on indulgence can feel awfully lonely when the feast is over. And yet, even as Henry gnawed his way through history, another monarch's legacy would be defined not by what she consumed, but by what she allegedly wrote, or didn't write. Hidden in a silver casket, wrapped in scandal, and delivered straight into the court of public suspicion. 8. Mary, Queen of Scots Casket Letters. History doesn't always leave fingerprints. Sometimes it just leaves a locked box, a few cryptic letters, and 4 centuries of speculation. Enter Mary, Queen of Scots, tragic icon, political pawn, and the star of one of the strangest and most hotly debated episodes in royal intrigue, the Casket Letters. A scandal wrapped in poetry, alleged affairs, and just enough forged handwriting to keep everyone guessing forever. It all begins with a silver casket, a small, ornate box reportedly filled with letters and sonnets, written in French, and supposedly in Mary's own hand. The contents were damning, if they were real. The year was 1567. Mary had already lived several lifetimes by that point. Crowned queen when she was 6 days old, married off to the Dauphin of France, widowed by 18, and back in Scotland shortly after, trying to wrangle a kingdom filled with enemies who smiled with their mouths and plotted with their knives. Then came Lord Darnley, her second husband. On paper, a good match, young, noble, and sufficiently Protestant to keep the peace. In reality, a volatile, jealous liability who made enemies faster than he made decisions. Their marriage deteriorated almost instantly, and in 1567, Darnley was murdered, blown up in his house. Well, technically, strangled first, then blown up. A murder so sloppy and theatrical, it could have been staged by an amateur dramatics troupe with a grudge. Suspicion fell everywhere, but mostly it fell on Mary and her close confidant and probable lover, James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. 3 months after Darnley's death, Mary married Bothwell. It was either an act of true passion or one of the worst PR moves in the history of monarchy. Her enemies pounced, and that's when the casket emerged. According to her Protestant opponents, who were very eager to dethrone her, a small silver box was discovered containing letters and poems written by Mary to Bothwell. They were passionate, intimate, some were borderline erotic. Others spoke of Darnley's death with chilling detachment. One line allegedly read, "I could wish to be with you when you kill him." If true, the letters were proof of everything: adultery, conspiracy, regicide. Mary's enemies called for her abdication, which, under duress, she gave. She was imprisoned, eventually fled to England, and asked her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, for help. Elizabeth responded by imprisoning her again, this time for nearly 2 decades. Spoiler alert, it didn't end well. But here's the mystery. No one can prove the letters were real. Mary herself denied writing them. Her supporters claimed they were forgeries, clumsily copied from existing letters and peppered with fake lines to incriminate her. Handwriting experts have argued both sides. Linguists say the style doesn't match. Others point out that, conveniently, the originals are now lost. Only copies and translations remain. So, What do we have? A queen accused by papers no one can authenticate, from a box no one can find, describing a relationship that may or may not have happened, leading to an execution that arguably changed the course of British history. And the best part? The silver casket, the smoking gun, simply disappeared. Did Mary write the letters? Were they political sabotage? A lover's poems twisted into evidence? Or just a spectacular hoax with deadly consequences? We'll likely never know. But in the end, the mystery outlasted the monarchy it tried to destroy. And speaking of things built to endure long past their expiration date, one of Mary's royal successors would leave behind something equally scandalous, not in writing, but in wood and leather. A bespoke invention, perfectly engineered for royal mischief. 9. Edward VII's love chair. Before he was king, Edward VII was simply Bertie, the playboy prince of the Victorian age. A man whose royal duties were often overshadowed by his more recreational pursuits. While his mother, Queen Victoria, mourned her husband for 4 decades and practically invented public restraint, Bertie went in the opposite direction. Full tilt into pleasure, scandal, and anything upholstered in red velvet. He smoked too much, drank too much, gambled a bit, and reportedly had a taste for frequent companionship. But the jewel in the crown of his romantic legacy, if one can call it that, wasn't a mistress, a scandalous affair, or a whispered nickname. It was a piece of furniture, a custom-designed chair, one that was built, quite literally, to accommodate his passions, known discreetly, and only slightly sarcastically, as le siège d'amour, or the love chair. This bizarre contraption was commissioned during one of Bertie's many visits to Le Chabanais, a famous Parisian brothel where no expense was spared and discretion was the house specialty. The brothel was elite. It catered to aristocrats, artists, and the occasional bored royal. Bertie, who was not known for moderation, was reportedly one of its most loyal clients. But here's the thing about being both overweight and overly energetic. Physics starts to work against you. By the time Bertie was middle-aged, he had gained considerable weight and reportedly struggled to, shall we say, balance form with function. Enter the love chair. This wasn't your average piece of Louis XV furniture. It was an engineering marvel of questionable taste. Crafted by expert Parisian artisans, the chair was designed to minimize physical strain for a large gentleman, while still maximizing access and visibility. Without violating modern decorum, let's just say the structure included strategic openings, sturdy armrests, and extra support brackets. Think less reading nook and more palace of ergonomics. The goal? To allow the Prince of Wales to indulge his favorite pastime with 2 participants, while avoiding the burden of, movement. Royalty is exhausting after all. The chair still exists. It's real. It was once housed in a private collection, later displayed, briefly and reluctantly, in a Paris museum, and even photographed, confirming that this wasn't just a salacious rumor passed around by prudish Victorians. And somehow that chair, that absurd, overbuilt piece of furniture, captures Bertie in miniature. The lavishness, the appetite, the relentless need to be entertained. Here was a man born into ceremonial duty who spent most of his life avoiding responsibility, and then, when finally crowned king at age 59, reigned for just 9 years. But for all his excess, he wasn't despised. Strangely, Bertie was quite popular. Maybe because he was honest about what he was. He didn't pretend to be a saint. He just wanted to be comfortable, even if that meant inventing new furniture categories. Still, Edward VII's eccentricities were at least confined to the living world. Some royals, however, seemed less content to stay there, because not every royal story ends with a coffin and a crown. Some go on, past death, past reason, into haunted halls and glowing staircases. 10. Princess Diana's ghost sightings. The British royal family has no shortage of spirits, both metaphorical and, according to some, alarmingly literal. And if any royal figure was destined to linger between worlds, it would be Princess Diana, the people's princess, the rebel royal, the icon whose life ended in tragedy, conspiracy, and an entire generation's trust issues. But according to a strange series of claims over the years, Diana's story didn't end in 1997. In fact, some believe it never really ended at all. From Althorpe Estate, her family's ancestral home, where she was buried on a secluded island, to various royal residences across Britain, reports of Diana's ghost have popped up with eerie consistency. Not dozens of tabloid sightings, mind you. Not gossip column clickbait. But a handful of oddly detailed, strangely consistent stories, quietly whispered by visitors, staff, and even spiritualists who swore they felt her in the room. Let's start with Althorpe. The estate is vast, beautiful, and intensely private. Her final resting place lies on an island in the middle of a lake called the Round Oval, a location chosen specifically for its peace and distance from the media circus that followed her in life. But despite its tranquility, guests over the years have reported unsettling sensations while walking the grounds. Cold spots, sudden rushes of emotion, lights flickering in the estate house without explanation. One longtime staff member, quoted anonymously in a biography, described a moment in the early 2000s when they walked into a sitting room and sensed someone behind them. The room was empty, the windows were closed, but the scent of Diana's favorite perfume, Quelque Fleur, was unmistakable. Other reports have been even more surreal. A handful of psychics and clairvoyants, often dismissed as opportunists but occasionally taken seriously by fringe historians, have claimed to communicate with Diana's spirit. In one particularly odd case from 2001, a medium in Yorkshire alleged that Diana had spoken through her, warning about tensions in the royal household and sending a message of protection for her sons, William and Harry. The claim was met with understandable skepticism. But what made it weirder was how specific the medium got, describing private rooms at Kensington Palace in detail she supposedly should not have known. And then there's the tale from Kensington Palace itself, Diana's London home, and now the official residence of her eldest son. A few former staffers and nighttime security personnel have mentioned lights turning on in sealed-off rooms, footsteps echoing in empty halls, and even a silhouette. A tall figure in a blouse and skirt, standing briefly at a window, then vanishing. No alarms were triggered. No one was caught. Are these just echoes of grief? Psychological projections? Collective guilt wrapped in Victorian ghost tropes? Possibly, but it's telling. But it's that Diana is the only modern royal who inspires this particular kind of spectral devotion. No one's claiming to see Queen Victoria pacing through her drawing room. But Diana? She never left the cultural consciousness. And maybe, for some, that means she never left at all. In a way, these sightings say more about the living than the dead. About how we mythologize those who die too young. About how we can't quite accept that someone so vibrant, so defiant, could just vanish. But while Diana's ghost is said to roam her family estate, another royal kept her spirits very much alive, not through haunting appearances, but by dressing her dogs like royalty and giving them their own photo ops. 11. Queen Elizabeth II and the Corgis tiaras. Of all the towering symbols of British monarchy, the gold coach, the balcony wave, the scepter that costs more than some small countries, perhaps none captured the heart of the late Queen Elizabeth II quite like her fleet of Pembroke Welsh corgis. They weren't just pets. They were loyal footstools, personal shadows, and living proof that, no matter how ancient the crown or how many countries you reign over, you're still allowed to be a little ridiculous. And yes, the rumors are true. The corgis had tiaras. Not officially, of course. There were no state-issued royal dog crowns passed down through canine generations. But over the years, whispers from palace insiders, staffers with long memories and loose lips, and the occasional photographer have all confirmed one strange, utterly charming truth. Her Majesty's beloved corgis were dressed for certain unofficial photo sessions in miniature regalia, including custom-made crowns. Not every royal anecdote is immortal. Some deserve to be. The image of a tiny, stubby-legged dog wearing a tiny diamond-encrusted crown while posing on a velvet cushion in Buckingham Palace is the kind of story that feels half fairy tale, half satire. But in this case, it also happens to be entirely in character. Queen Elizabeth II bred and raised more than 30 corgis during her reign. She received her first, Susan, for her 18th birthday in 1944, and the bloodline continued for decades. The dogs had names like Whisper, Willow, and Vulcan. Names that would sound pretentious on a yacht, but somehow worked perfectly for royally sanctioned quadrupeds. They followed her everywhere, riding in cars, trotting beside her on castle grounds, even accompanying her on foreign trips. At one point, palace staff were reportedly instructed to speak to the dogs in polite tones only and prepare their meals from fresh meats. A royal taster for the dogs? Not impossible. The tiaras, then, were not a step too far. In fact, they were an extension of the monarch's peculiar, deeply personal relationship with her corgis. Animals that never bowed, never lied, never leaked to the press, and never asked for a peerage. For a woman who lived most of her life in front of a lens, in stiff clothes, under constant scrutiny, the corgis were a buffer, an escape, a reminder that royalty, at its most absurd, could still be fun. The photos of the dogs in tiaras were never officially released, but insiders say they were used as private Christmas cards, gifts to close friends, and tokens of humor in a family famously allergic to self-awareness. Some versions of the story claim that the tiaras were not actually jewel-encrusted but made of silver paper or costume-quality metal, or just carefully designed props that looked the part. The truth? Likely a mix of all three. And that's what makes it better. Because whether they were real diamonds or not, the message was clear. The monarchy might be ancient, but it still had a sense of humor, even if it was dressed in fur and waddling down a palace hallway. Of course, not everyone in the royal family found humor in the fantastical. One king, a few centuries earlier, saw something far more sinister, not in dogs, but in witches. And instead of tiaras, he preferred holy water, salt circles, and demonology. 12. James's fear of witchcraft. He ruled over a unified crown, commissioned the most famous English Bible translation in history, and once declared that tobacco was a stinking custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose. But while King James I of England and VI of Scotland had no shortage of strong opinions, one fear seemed to consume him more than any other. Witches. Not metaphorically, not politically, literally. Spellcasting, broom-riding, devil-bargaining witches, and he was convinced they were out to get him. To understand James's obsession, you have to look at both his upbringing and his insecurities. He came into the world amid violent political chaos. His mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, had been forced to abdicate when James was just a baby, and he was raised in a fog of suspicion, control, and heavy theological debate. This was a king who had religion baked into his bones and paranoia scribbled into the margins. He believed his crown was a divine appointment, and therefore any threat to it was also a threat to God. And that made witchcraft personal. His fear of the dark arts reached new heights in 1589 when he was set to marry Princess Anne of Denmark. The journey across the North Sea was plagued by violent storms. Ships were damaged, the voyage was delayed. And James, instead of chalking it up to bad weather or poor navigation, jumped straight to witchcraft. Clearly someone, or several someones, had summoned a storm to kill him, probably with the help of Satan. When he returned to Scotland, James personally oversaw the infamous North Berwick witch trials, during which over 70 people were accused of conspiring to assassinate him using black magic. Some were tortured, some were executed. One woman was accused of summoning the storm by throwing a cat into the sea. The feline allegedly tied to a human corpse and cursed for good measure. James didn't just endorse these trials, he wrote about them. In 1597, he published Demonology, a formal treatise on witchcraft, necromancy, and demonic possession. It wasn't just royal curiosity, it was a guidebook on how to identify, prosecute, and eliminate witches, with footnotes. He saw himself as a warrior king of faith, standing between the Christian world and the infernal powers clawing at its edges. The book argued that witches were real, dangerous, and often female. It warned of charms, familiars, incantations, and contracts with the devil. For James, witchcraft wasn't just heresy. It was treason against divine order. It justified surveillance, torture, and execution. It also helped him control his narrative. If enemies lurked in shadow, he could cast himself as the light. And yet, as he aged and his reign matured, James began to cool his crusade. By the time he sat on the English throne, the hysteria had dimmed. He grew more skeptical of the more outrageous claims, occasionally even pardoning accused witches. Whether this shift was genuine, enlightenment, or political optics remains unclear. Still, the paranoia he unleashed, through policy and propaganda, would echo for decades. His legacy wasn't just a Bible or a union of crowns, but a generation of suspicion, trials, and hangings dressed up as divine justice. And while James feared the dead rising to claim his crown, one of his royal successors would discover that in death he was more useful than ever, not as a ghost, but as a miracle worker. 13. Henry VI's healing corpse. It's not every day a king becomes more powerful after death, but then again, nothing about Henry VI's life was particularly ordinary. A king crowned as an infant, stripped of his throne twice, imprisoned in his own kingdom, and finally found mysteriously dead in the Tower of London. Henry was more symbol than sovereign. And yet, in the twisted aftermath of the Wars of the Roses, his lifeless body reportedly developed a surprising posthumous talent. He started performing miracles. To understand how bizarre this claim truly is, you have to understand Henry himself. He wasn't exactly king material. Sensitive, devout, painfully passive, he was more comfortable in a chapel than a war room. The son of the legendary Henry V, the hero of Agincourt, Henry VI came to power in 1422 at just 9 months old. By the time he was old enough to rule in his own right, the kingdom was in chaos and his advisors were doing a poor job of pretending it wasn't. He was pious to the point of impracticality. He founded colleges. He prayed a lot. He refused to engage in power struggles with the kind of political ruthlessness the job demanded. And when civil war tore the kingdom in half, Henry became more of a royal football than a ruler, passed between factions, captured, restored, and finally deposed for good by Edward IV. And then, in 1471, he died suddenly in the Tower of London. Officially, it was said he died of melancholy. Unofficially, most historians believe he was murdered, likely by Edward IV's men, or at least with Edward's blessing. No autopsy, of course. Just a body, a crown that moved on, and a quiet burial at Chertsey Abbey. But here's where things get strange. Almost immediately after his death, rumors began to swirl that Henry's corpse was doing things no corpse should be doing. Visitors to his tomb claimed to have experienced spontaneous healings. The blind saw light. The sick recovered. A man with a crippled leg claimed he could walk again after praying near Henry's grave. Word spread fast. Within a few years, Henry VI was being venerated as a sort of unofficial saint. Not canonized, but certainly worshipped. Pilgrims flocked to his burial site. Offerings were left. Stories multiplied. His cult following grew so intense that, by the time Henry VII, of the rival Tudor line, took the throne, even he saw value in aligning with the miraculous legacy of the man his family had once helped dethrone. So what do you do when the former king your dynasty replaced starts performing miracles from the afterlife? Easy. You move the body. In 1484, Henry's remains were exhumed and reinterred at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, where royal visitors could pay respects under more controlled circumstances. It was also a strategic move, consolidating sacred ground with political legitimacy. A dead king who heals is still useful if he makes your reign look ordained by heaven, of course, There's no hard evidence of these miracles. No documentation beyond hearsay, relics, and the ever-reliable medieval rumor mill. But that's what makes it fascinating. A king who failed in life became a source of hope in death. A quiet, pious man transformed into a kind of relic himself. He wasn't the only royal to develop a strange relationship with nature. But while Henry's body drew pilgrims long after it stopped breathing, one modern prince decided he didn't need death to commune with the natural world. He preferred to talk to the plants. 14. Prince Charles. Talking to plants. When the tabloids caught wind that Prince Charles, now King Charles III, enjoyed conversations with his garden plants, the mockery was swift, brutal, and expected. Headlines branded him as an eccentric royal talking to begonias, the out-of-touch air murmuring sweet nothings to shrubs while waiting for his mother's record-breaking reign to end. To the British public, it was confirmation. This was a man who wore cufflinks to bed, believed in homeopathy, and thought parsley could be reasoned with. But beneath the easy jokes and tabloid cartoons was a surprisingly consistent philosophy. One that, to his credit, Charles never tried to hide. In fact, he proudly admitted it. In 1986, during an interview to promote organic farming, years before it was trendy, Charles said something that would follow him for decades. "I'd just come and talk to the plants, really. Very important to talk to them. They respond, I find." It was a moment of awkward honesty delivered in the plummy tone of a man who genuinely didn't understand why that might seem odd. And while the press had a field day, Charles wasn't being whimsical. He was being literal. The Prince of Wales truly believed, and perhaps still does, that communication with nature plays a vital role in healthy stewardship of the environment. To him, talking to plants wasn't eccentricity. It was empathy. The world rolled its eyes. Botanists, psychologists, and anyone with access to a houseplant had opinions. But in a strange twist, the idea that plants respond to human interaction actually has some grounding in science, at least in a vague, metaphorical sense. Studies have shown that vibrations from sound waves can stimulate plant growth. Other research has explored how tone, light, and even touch might affect plant behavior. Whether or not a ficus appreciates compliments is debatable. But as with many things Charles has said, the sentiment, while awkwardly phrased, wasn't entirely baseless. The future king wasn't just whispering into rose petals. His passion for the environment extended far beyond garden chit-chat. He was advocating for organic agriculture, sustainable architecture, and environmental conservation decades before most world leaders were even spelling climate change correctly. He created Ducci Originals, an organic food brand, now a major success, and redesigned housing developments to reflect ecological values. So yes, he talked to plants. But he also funded entire woodlands. Still, the image of Charles pacing through a dewy greenhouse, whispering encouragement to a potted fern, proved too irresistible for comedians and critics alike. It cemented his reputation as the quirky royal, a man with strong opinions on everything from urban planning to yogurt, frequently voiced with the intensity of someone who never quite learned how to be publicly casual. But Charles never disavowed the comment. If anything, he doubled down. In a 2010 interview, he clarified, "I didn't actually say I talked to the plants, I said I instructed them." As if the distinction between a conversation and a monologue made it better. And perhaps that's the most revealing part. Charles saw himself not as an oddity, but as a custodian, someone responsible for the well-being of not just people, but everything green and growing. To him, the land wasn't property, it was kin. Of course, some royal legacies are built in gardens, others are buried under parking lots. Because the next royal mystery involves a missing monarch, a centuries-old corpse, and a skeleton that waited patiently beneath a modern-day convenience store to be found. 15. Richard III's lost skeleton. For over 5 centuries, the whereabouts of King Richard III's body remained one of British history's more quietly nagging questions. Like a missing puzzle piece from a long-forgotten crime scene. Everyone knew he died at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, the last English king to die in combat. Everyone agreed he was hastily buried somewhere in Leicester after being humiliated, stripped, and paraded like a cautionary tale. But where exactly? That part got murky. As the centuries rolled on, stories shifted. Some said his bones were dumped in the River Soar. Others claimed his tomb was destroyed during the dissolution of the monasteries. The consensus was simple. Richard III's remains were lost to time. Then, in 2012, they were found, beneath a parking lot. It wasn't just any parking lot. It sat over the site of the former Greyfriars Church in Leicester, a long-demolished medieval friary turned city council tarmac. And the rediscovery wasn't accidental. It came about through a combination of dogged historical research, local ambition, and a healthy dose of, "This is probably a bad idea, but let's try it anyway," energy from the Richard III Society, a group dedicated to restoring the king's tarnished legacy. Yes, he had a fan club. Armed with maps, ground-penetrating radar, and an extraordinary amount of optimism, archaeologists began digging in a parking space labeled with a large R. Within days, they hit skeletal remains. Days after that, they realized what they had. The skeleton was male, of the correct age, and notably curved. A distinct S-shaped spine, consistent with scoliosis, which had long been part of Richard's legend. The initial reaction from the public was disbelief. A king, a literal king, lying beneath a council car park next to a social services building? It felt like satire. It felt like Britain accidentally tripped over its own history while searching for loose change. But the science was real. DNA testing, matched against the living descendants of Richard's sister, confirmed the identity. The wounds on the skull and body matched historical descriptions of his brutal death, including a massive blow to the back of the head, likely inflicted after he was already disarmed. For centuries, Richard III had been the Shakespearean villain, the crook-backed usurper who murdered his nephews in the Tower and stole the crown. But now, his story shifted. He wasn't just the scheming hunchback anymore. He was also a young man, physically deformed, likely insecure, navigating one of the bloodiest chapters in English history. Suddenly, the myth had a skeleton, a spine, a face. The discovery reignited debates. Was Richard truly a villain? Or was he the victim of Tudor propaganda? His defenders argued that his reputation had been shaped not by fact, but by theater, that Shakespeare's Richard was more caricature than king. In 2015, he was reburied with full royal honors in Leicester Cathedral, complete with a tombstone, a procession, and televised coverage. It was solemn, moving, and slightly surreal. A medieval king killed in battle, buried under asphalt, and returned to royalty by forensic science. Yet for all the dignity restored to Richard, the irony lingered. Centuries of searching, all for a body beneath a car park, footsteps from a Nando's. But not all royal secrets are dug up. Some are worn, tightly, uncomfortably, and hidden beneath layers of uniform and shame. because one king's obsession wasn't with bones or ghosts, but with corsets. 16. George IV's corset habit. There are royal quirks, and then there are royal obsessions stitched into the very fabric of monarchy, or in the case of King George IV, the fabric of a very tight corset. Yes, the man who once styled himself as the first gentleman of Europe, the prince who turned Brighton into a playground of absurd architecture and velvet upholstery, had a secret weapon for public appearances, a military-grade corset laced so tightly it could practically hold back a revolution. At first glance, George IV didn't strike anyone as the type to suffer for fashion. He was flamboyant, indulgent, and had the self-control of a child in a confectionery. His appetites were the stuff of legend. He reportedly drank like a sailor, dined like an emperor, and expanded accordingly. By his 40s, he was rumored to weigh nearly 250 pounds, which, while not shocking by modern standards, was significant in a time when portraiture still politely trimmed the waistlines of kings. But George didn't just expand. He squeezed back. Behind the brocade waistcoats and polished uniforms, he wore corsets designed to reshape his increasingly rebellious torso into something approximating regality. Not just light support. We're talking heavily boned, whale-stiffened, steel-reinforced undergarments that made Victorian ladies look positively casual. According to his tailors, George's corsets were not merely decorative. They were tools of royal illusion, designed to force his considerable girth into the fashionable silhouette of the day. These weren't quick fixes for the occasional banquet. George reportedly wore his corset for hours at a time, sometimes to the point of physical discomfort or even fainting. He did this not out of necessity, but out of vanity. A relentless desire to appear youthful, dashing, and slender, even as his lifestyle pulled in the opposite direction. The contradiction is hard to miss. Here was a king who built the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, a seaside palace that looked like a cross between the Taj Mahal and a decadent fever dream, yet couldn't tolerate seeing himself with a realistic waistline. He covered his walls in silk, but cinched his abdomen like a theater curtain. His contemporaries noticed. Court gossip often included sly comments about the king's ever-tightening wardrobe. One foreign diplomat, after meeting him, remarked with dry cruelty that George seemed to be bursting at the seams with princely ambition and too many puddings. But George powered on, lacing himself tighter, painting his cheeks, and powdering his hair to maintain the illusion of control and elegance. In private, his health suffered. The corsets, combined with his excessive lifestyle, contributed to breathing difficulties and likely digestion problems. But admitting defeat, letting the royal gut go untamed, was unthinkable. So he chose pain over exposure, illusion over ease. Because for George IV, royalty was performance, and every inch of his body was part of the costume. And perhaps it was fitting. He ruled during a time when appearances mattered more than policy, when monarchs were expected to be living symbols, not governing bodies. He wasn't admired for his leadership. He was watched for his spectacle. But while George laced himself into painful elegance, one of his royal relatives would come face to face with a far more uncontrollable phenomenon, a sudden, strange, and entirely contagious form of chaos. Not political rebellion, not scandal, but something much weirder. Dancing. Until death. 17. The dancing plague visit. Royal visits are usually exercises in polite ceremony. Handshakes, speeches, the occasional ribbon cutting, all performed under a cloud of expensive perfume and ancient obligation. But when Marianne of England, also known as Bloody Mary, was told about a disturbing outbreak on the continent, the typical script flew straight out the window. She wasn't dealing with rebellion, or war, or treason. She was dealing with a plague of dancing, and not the good kind. It happened in the early 16th century, primarily in the city of Strasbourg, where reports claimed that dozens, then hundreds, of people began dancing uncontrollably in the streets. Not at a party, not to music, just dancing, wildly, for days, until they collapsed from exhaustion. Some reportedly danced themselves to death. The accounts were so strange, so grotesquely absurd, that many modern historians have assumed it was mass hysteria, or ergot poisoning, a hallucinogenic fungus found in rye, or possibly just deeply misinterpreted medieval nonsense. But at the time it was taken very seriously, and word of it spread like wildfire, including to the English court where Mary was told of it secondhand, possibly via diplomatic letters or church briefings. And according to later anecdotes, she didn't take it well. Unlike her father, the famously boisterous Henry VIII, Mary was deeply devout, emotionally intense, and surrounded by chronic fear of rebellion, of divine punishment, and of losing control. Her reign was already fragile, haunted by religious conflict and personal isolation. So when she heard that a group of European peasants had been overtaken by a dancing madness, some stories claim she saw it as something far darker than disease. She saw it as a spiritual warning. In one account, likely apocryphal but no less persistent, Mary reportedly forbade music and dance at court for several weeks after hearing about the incident, fearing that such temptations of the flesh might summon a similar curse on English soil. Some chroniclers claimed she consulted clergy for advice, or at least treated the incident as demonic in nature. Others suggest she became convinced that such outbreaks were proof that society had grown too sinful, that the plague was not in the body, but in the soul. While no official decree against dancing exists in the historical record from that period, multiple sources suggest a brief and bizarre chill over courtly festivities during her reign. Whether inspired by the Strasbourg event or not, it fit perfectly with Mary's worldview. Joy as a dangerous indulgence, and bodily abandon as a gateway to corruption. And yet, what fascinated the court, and unnerved Mary, was how sudden and irrational the outbreak seemed. People of all ages and backgrounds were struck. No clear pattern, no clear cause. It defied medical logic and moral theory alike. It reminded everyone, even those with crowns, that control is a fragile illusion. For Mary, the fear wasn't just that her people might start dancing, it was that they might stop listening, because if joy could become madness, then perhaps madness could become rebellion. But while Mary feared losing control to invisible forces, another queen, just a generation later, would have the opposite problem: too much control in one too many fingers. 18. Anne Boleyn's sixth finger. In the grand gallery of Tudor mythology, Anne Boleyn has always held a special, shadowy seat, somewhere between seductress and scapegoat, saint and sorceress. Her story is legendary. The clever, charismatic woman who rose from lady-in-waiting to Queen of England, upended the Catholic Church, failed to produce a male heir, and was beheaded less than 3 years after her coronation. But nestled inside this already Shakespearean tale is one of the most bizarre and persistent physical rumors in royal history, that Anne Boleyn had 6 fingers on one hand. It's a detail that has haunted her image for centuries. A curious anatomical footnote twisted into folklore and fed to generations like a Grimm's fairy tale gone political. The supposed extra finger, usually described as a small, deformed 6th digit on her right hand, has been cited as evidence of everything from sorcery to moral corruption, as though her body itself was betraying divine order. So where did this rumor come from? Not from her contemporaries, interestingly. During Anne's lifetime, and even shortly after her death in 1536, there are no surviving records from court officials, ambassadors, or even her enemies that mention any physical deformity. She was famously described as elegant, witty, and fashionable, a queen who set trends and rewrote court dynamics. The Spanish ambassador Eustace Chapuis, no friend of Anne's, referred to her as the concubine in letters, but never mentioned a sixth finger. And he definitely would have, had there been something that scandalous to exploit. The tale seems to have originated in the decades following her execution, particularly from the pen of Nicholas Sanders, a Catholic recusant writing during the reign of Elizabeth I, Anne's daughter. Sanders had a political axe to grind. He wasn't just a historian. He was part of a movement actively trying to discredit the Protestant monarchy. Painting Anne as physically deformed, morally depraved, and supernaturally cursed was great propaganda. And a sixth finger? That was practically a medieval red flag for witchcraft. Sanders claimed Anne had a projecting tooth, a large wart under her chin, and an extra finger, all features associated with witchy folklore. It was character assassination by way of phrenology, and over time the story stuck. It was too juicy, too symbolic to let go. The irony, of course, is that Anne Boleyn was probably physically unremarkable by Tudor beauty standards. Not the flawless blonde ideal, but striking in her own right. Dark hair, dark eyes, olive skin, and reportedly a long, elegant neck. No mention of deformities. No accounts of gloves worn at all times, no careful portraits hiding her right hand in a shawl. In fact, in most surviving portraits, her hands are visible, and quite normal. And yet, the sixth finger persists, because it serves a narrative. A woman too smart, too influential, too ambitious. Well, something must have been wrong with her. Something unnatural. The extra finger became a metaphor, a way to mark her as other, as dangerous, as someone who reached beyond her station, both literally and figuratively. It's telling that Anne, who lived and died in the grip of Tudor power games, is remembered not for her policies, her mind, or even her daughter, but for an alleged phantom digit, a single finger she almost certainly never had, yet which history refused to let go of. But if Anne's legend was shaped by superstition and smear campaigns, her royal descendant took a different approach, embracing a daily vice with royal confidence and a morning fork. 19. Victoria's morning whiskey. In the pantheon of British monarchs, Queen Victoria is often portrayed as a dour figure in black. The eternal widow, the emblem of restraint, the human embodiment of the phrase, "We are not amused." But behind the veil and the strict moral codes she supposedly championed was a woman of appetites, humor, and, in the quiet of her private quarters, a taste for whiskey with breakfast. Yes, the queen who gave her name to an era of primness reportedly began her day not with tea, but with a healthy nip of scotch, often taken alongside her eggs. It wasn't an accidental swig, nor a secret habit. It was part of her established morning routine. The most powerful woman in the world woke up, sat down to breakfast, and had a drink. It sounds absurd, until you consider the time period. In Victorian Britain, whiskey wasn't viewed quite the same way it is now. It wasn't just a social drink, it was medicinal, touted as a tonic, a digestive aid, a remedy for fatigue, and a preventative for everything from colds to melancholia. And Victoria, who ruled over a vast empire riddled with discomforts and obligations, was no stranger to melancholia. Her taste for whiskey was particularly directed at Scotch, and even more specifically, the whiskey produced at Lochnagar Distillery, located near Balmoral Castle, her beloved Highland retreat. In fact, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were so taken with the distillery that they granted it a royal warrant in 1848 after a personal visit. From that point forward, Royal Lochnagar became a fixture of the royal household, not just for entertaining guests, but for the monarch's own use. According to some accounts, Victoria would take her whiskey mixed with claret, a robust red wine, a concoction known appropriately enough as a morning glory fizz. In other stories, it's simply a dram served neat, strong, and undiluted, much like the woman herself. It wasn't indulgence, it was ritual. a small act of control over a life that allowed for very little of it. This habit, unsurprisingly, didn't feature in the official portraits or palace speeches. The monarchy liked its legends pure, and Victoria was meant to be a pillar of virtue, not a woman swirling a tumbler before noon. But her private life, as detailed in journals, letters, and the testimony of staff, reveals a far more textured personality. She swore in multiple languages, doted on her children, hated tight shoes, adored her Highland servants, and once scandalized dinner guests by asking for more venison in the middle of a sermon. The whiskey, then, wasn't rebellion. It was authenticity. A queen who understood the weight of ceremony but wasn't afraid to lace it with something a little stronger. Even in her later years, when age and grief clouded her public image, Victoria never abandoned the small luxuries that made royal life tolerable. Whether it was her custom bathing machine, her army of footmen, or the gentle burn of a Highland single malt, she understood that power and comfort were not mutually exclusive. And yet, while Victoria's whiskey merely raised eyebrows, a later royal would ignite an international scandal. Not with a drink, but with a costume so outrageous it still haunts the House of Windsor to this day. 20. Prince Harry's Nazi costume. Of all the headlines the British royal family has tried to bury, few have been as instantly radioactive, or as enduringly embarrassing, as the one printed in The Sun on January 13, 2005. The front page showed Prince Harry, then 20 years old, grinning at a private costume party in Wiltshire, wearing khaki, a red armband with a swastika, and holding a drink. The headline, Harry the Nazi. It wasn't clever, it wasn't subtle. It was a scandal in capital letters, and it tore through the public imagination like a wildfire made of bad decisions and poor parenting. To say the photo caused outrage would be an understatement. Politicians condemned it. Jewish leaders expressed deep hurt. Holocaust survivors called it grotesque. Even the palace, which usually responds to public controversy with a mix of dignified silence and strategic misdirection, issued an immediate apology on Harry's behalf. It wasn't just that a member of the royal family wore something offensive, it was the symbolism, the sheer historical absurdity of it. Prince Harry, grandson of Queen Elizabeth II, great-grandson of King George VI, the same monarch who led Britain through World War II against Nazi Germany, had, even briefly, dressed as the enemy. Not as a joke about history, not as some clever satire, just for fun, at a party. The context didn't help. The theme of the party was colonial and native, a title that, in hindsight, probably should have raised a few red flags on its own. But while other guests arrived in safari gear or mock tribal outfits, problematic in their own right, Harry strolled in as a Luftwaffe pilot, complete with the swastika armband, a symbol that carries with it not only genocide and fascism, but the personal weight of his own family's wartime legacy. Critics were quick to point out that this wasn't just a youthful blunder. Harry, despite being barely out of his teens, was no ordinary 20-year-old. He was a public figure, a representative of a monarchy that survives, in part, by maintaining the illusion of moral authority. And here he was, caught in a moment that felt, to many, like casual cruelty disguised as royal privilege. The fallout was swift. Harry apologized the next day, saying he was very sorry if I caused any offense or embarrassment. A statement so carefully sanitized, it could have been printed on porcelain. But behind the scenes, the moment reportedly prompted a reckoning. Charles was furious. William was embarrassed. The palace PR machine went into overdrive, and Harry, perhaps for the first time, began to understand that his actions, once dismissed as just Harry being Harry, had consequences far beyond himself. In the years that followed, Harry's image transformed. Military service, charity work, mental health advocacy. He grew up, publicly and painfully, under the weight of that mistake. In interviews much later, he would reflect on the incident with far more clarity, calling it one of the biggest mistakes of my life, and saying he was deeply ashamed. He acknowledged that he didn't understand history, or the gravity of the symbol he wore, and that the moment shaped his later commitment to education, service, and activism. But the image remains. A blurry photo of a prince in a costume, frozen in a split second of thoughtlessness that continues to echo through the institution he was born into. An institution built on image, pageantry, and precisely the kind of historical reverence that makes such mistakes hard to forgive. And yet, if Harry's scandal was a product of youth and privilege colliding in public, another royal controversy involved something far older and far stranger, a crime that targeted not the monarchy itself, but one of its most intimate and highly guarded belongings, royal underwear. 21. The stolen royal undies. In the realm of royal scandal, some stories come in with a bang. Abdications, affairs, statements that rattle governments. And then there are the stories that arrive in whispers, wrapped in silk, carefully folded, and tucked into the back of an auction catalog. One such tale involves Queen Victoria's underwear, or, more specifically, the time someone stole a pair and tried to sell it to the highest bidder. Yes, this happened. And no, this isn't a lowbrow tabloid rumor. It's a documented oddity that has baffled historians, tickled auctioneers, and proven, once again, that nothing is off limits when it comes to royal memorabilia. Let's rewind. Queen Victoria, for all her stiff portraits and black-clad mourning, was surprisingly practical in matters of dress. Her personal garments, particularly in later life, were loose, modest, and made with comfort in mind. She favored wide bloomers, heavy petticoats, and long cotton drawers that reached well past the knee, function over fashion, breathability over bravado. But because she was queen, even her underclothes were made with the finest materials and embroidered with royal insignia, sometimes with her initials, sometimes with a crown. These were not off-the-rack items. These were monarchical textiles, and over time, they became objects of fascination. Enter the collectors. In the early 21st century, a strange submarket began to form around royal undergarments. Items supposedly worn by Queen Victoria, some dating from the 1860s to the 1890s, began appearing in auction houses. These weren't backroom deals. They were public sales, complete with certificates of provenance, fabric analysis, and embroidered clues. One such pair, listed by Lyon and Turnbull in Edinburgh, sold for over £4,000, largely due to the embroidered VR, for Victoria Regina, and the fact that the waistband measured over 50 inches, giving insight into her later life figure. But things took a turn from quirky to questionable when it was discovered that some of these items had gone missing from private royal collections or from former royal residences turned museums. Suddenly, what had been a charming piece of Victoriana became a low-stakes mystery. Were some of Queen Victoria's undergarments stolen? One alleged incident involved a dealer attempting to sell a pair of bloomers that had once belonged to a private estate with historical ties to the royal family. When pressed for documentation, the trail became murky. Questions arose. Who had possession? How did they get them? Were these pieces gifted, misplaced, or lifted in a moment of opportunistic thievery? No one was prosecuted. No arrests were made. But the story lingered. It raised uncomfortable questions about where the line between history and theft really lies, especially when it comes to royal relics. Is a 130-year-old pair of bloomers a national treasure? A harmless oddity? Or a stolen artifact wrapped in lace? And while the idea of Queen Victoria's drawers being passed from gloved hand to gloved hand at a Sotheby's preview might sound absurd, it speaks to something oddly persistent: the need to make monarchs human. If we can glimpse their vulnerabilities, even their laundry, perhaps they feel more real. But the line between reverence and voyeurism is thin, very thin. And in this case, made of fine Victorian cotton. Yet not all royal remains were so casually removed. One king, upon losing his head, quite literally, was given a macabre final courtesy that blurred the line between dignity and surrealism. They stitched it back on. 22. Charles I's head stitched on. The execution of King Charles I in 1649 marked one of the most seismic shifts in British history, the first and only time a reigning monarch was tried, sentenced, and publicly executed by his own people. It was the final act of a long and bitter civil war between royalists and parliamentarians, a battle not just over policy, but over who held divine authority. Spoiler: Parliament won, and Charles lost. His head, quite specifically. The scene was dramatic, theatrical, and deliberately humiliating. On a cold January morning in Whitehall, the king, dressed in 2 shirts so he wouldn't shiver and appear afraid, stepped onto the scaffold before a silent crowd. He gave a short speech defending his divine right, laid his neck on the block, and with a single swift stroke of the executioner's axe, was beheaded. What followed, however, was even stranger. As per custom, the executioner held up Charles's severed head for the crowd to see, a visual symbol that the monarchy had quite literally been overthrown. But behind the scenes, something far more peculiar was being arranged. Charles's head was sewn back onto his body. Why? In part because ceremony dies hard, even in revolution. After the execution, Charles's remains were handed over to loyal royalists, who insisted on giving him a dignified burial, however impossible that sounded given the circumstances. The men in charge were keen to preserve the illusion, if not the reality, of royal sanctity. And so, before the king was laid in his coffin, a surgeon or royal attendant reportedly stitched his head back onto his body, a crude but respectful act, done not for medical reasons obviously, but for symbolic ones. It wasn't the first time something like this had been done. In a world obsessed with bodily wholeness in death, especially among the elite, reattaching heads was seen as a small but meaningful gesture, a kind of posthumous apology. Even in the face of regicide, some lines couldn't be crossed without trying to cross back. Charles's body, now visually intact, was placed in a coffin and buried in St. George's Chapel, Windsor, next to Henry VIII and Jane Seymour, in what was meant to be a quiet, unpublicized burial. Parliament didn't want to make a martyr of him. There were no grand processions, no eulogies, no public grief allowed, just a subdued, strange final chapter to a king who had lost everything, including his crown and his head, in the name of constitutional reform. Centuries later, during the 19th century, when Prince Albert ordered renovations at Windsor, Charles's coffin was briefly opened. According to eyewitnesses, the skull had clearly been separated from the body at some point, but traces of the seam where it had been reattached were still visible. The final proof that even decapitated kings could be dressed up one last time. It's both macabre and oddly touching, the idea that in death, those loyal to Charles still tried to preserve his dignity. The monarchy had fallen, but its rituals remained. And perhaps that's the story of monarchy in miniature. Even when the head is gone, the body of tradition keeps moving, sewn together by pageantry, stubbornness, and sheer denial. But if Charles's tragic end was sewn back into something resembling closure, another royal story would unravel in the opposite direction, with one queen's legacy reduced to a tragic pattern of loss, strange medicine, and a dozen pregnancies that almost never reached childhood. 23. Queen Anne's dozen pregnancies. The throne is often imagined as a seat of power, control, and lineage. But for Queen Anne, the last monarch of the House of Stuart, it became a lonely place, haunted by the cries of children, that never lived to grow old. Behind the weight of her crown was a body relentlessly betrayed by biology, and a private life marked not by scandal or splendor, but by repeated grief. Over the course of her marriage, Queen Anne experienced 17 pregnancies, but only one child lived past infancy, and even he died before the age of 12. It was a pattern that defied probability and tormented Anne for decades. Her personal story was not only medically baffling, but emotionally brutal, a silent tragedy unfolding in the background of a public life. If royalty is about continuity, Anne's legacy was a monarch's worst nightmare, a royal bloodline that simply refused to continue. Her troubles began early. Married at 18 to Prince George of Denmark, Anne immediately began trying to produce an heir, as was expected of any royal bride. Her first pregnancy ended in miscarriage, so did the second, and then a stillbirth, then a live birth, a daughter, who died within hours. And so it went, again and again, a cruel carousel of hope and heartbreak. In 1689, Anne gave birth to Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, her only child to survive past infancy. He became the focus of her life, a fragile beacon of continuity for the Stuart dynasty. But William was sickly, plagued by chronic illness from the beginning. By the age of 11, he was dead. Anne, reportedly, was never the same again. The medical mystery behind Anne's reproductive disasters has never been definitively solved. Some historians speculate she suffered from lupus, or antiphospholipid syndrome, an autoimmune condition that increases the risk of miscarriage. Others suggest type 2 diabetes, or a hormonal imbalance exacerbated by the treatments of the time, which of course included bloodletting, mercury, and an alarming number of leeches. What's clear is that her body was failing her again and again in the most painful and publicly humiliating way possible. She was a queen who could not do the one thing monarchy most demanded of her: produce a living heir. It wasn't just personal tragedy. It was a constitutional crisis. By the early 1700s, the Stuart line was running out of options. Parliament passed the Act of Settlement in 1701, legally barring Catholics from inheriting the throne and skipping over dozens of closer blood relatives to ensure a Protestant succession. When Anne died in 1714, childless and chronically ill, the throne passed to George I, a distant relative from the German House of Hanover, who didn't even speak English. Thus ended the Stuart line, not with treason or defeat, but with silence. In portraits, Queen Anne appears heavy, tired, draped in finery that seems to weigh more than just gold. Her reign was marked by important political events: the unification of England and Scotland, the War of the Spanish Succession, but her personal life was defined by absence. Empty cradles, closed nurseries, the kind of quiet sadness that doesn't make headlines but never stops echoing through history. And yet, within the ornate walls of the palace, Anne wasn't the only one surrounded by invisible forces. Because while she mourned children that never lived, another royal walked the halls with a ghost that definitely didn't exist. Or at least, not in any way that guests found reassuring. 24. Princess Alexandra's Invisible Cat. If you're ever invited to a royal court, you'd be wise to mind your manners, adjust your volume, and, just in case, avoid stepping on invisible cats. That last bit may seem oddly specific, but not if you were a guest of Princess Alexandra of Bavaria, a 19th century royal who was, by all outward appearances, the image of delicate nobility. She wrote essays, translated books, loved white clothing, and harbored a deep fascination with etiquette. But hidden beneath her lace and propriety was a world entirely her own, a world that included an imaginary ghost-like feline companion. According to multiple accounts from the time, Princess Alexandra believed she was constantly accompanied by a phantom white cat, which she claimed followed her around the palace grounds. She was rarely seen without acknowledging its presence, pausing in doorways to let it pass, stepping aside in corridors so it wouldn't be trampled, and occasionally warning others to be careful where they walked. The creature, invisible to everyone else, was vividly real to her. And no one in court dared argue. This wasn't just an idle fancy. Alexandra was deeply convinced of the cat's existence. It wasn't a passing delusion or a whimsical habit like carrying a fan in winter. It was a consistent belief that shaped how she moved through the world. And oddly enough, in the grand halls of Bavaria's royal family, no one stopped her, perhaps because it was easier to accommodate a ghost cat than confront a royal's possible instability. But that wasn't the only peculiar belief she held. In what may be one of the most bizarre self-diagnoses in history, Alexandra also believed, and this is well documented, that she had swallowed a grand piano made of glass. Not a small music box-sized trinket. A full-sized, transparent grand piano resting delicately inside her body. She was reportedly terrified that any sudden movement or jostling would shatter it, killing her instantly. As a result, she walked with extreme care, wore only white to reflect her fragility, and insisted that those around her treat her with extraordinary caution. Modern historians speculate she suffered from a form of delusional disorder or schizophrenia, though such diagnoses were non-existent at the time. Instead, her behaviors were chalked up to melancholy or nervous sensitivities, common euphemisms in an era that pathologized female eccentricity while avoiding uncomfortable truths. The court's solution? They simply let her believe. Her invisible cat, then, was just one expression of a deeply complex inner life. It may have been a coping mechanism, a projection, or simply a companion conjured in a mind overwhelmed by the constraints of royalty. After all, Alexandra was the daughter of King Ludwig I of Bavaria, a man famous for his own oddities. Her brother, King Ludwig II, would later build Neuschwanstein Castle, the architectural embodiment of a fantasy world. So perhaps eccentricity ran in the family, like silverware or scandal. The ghost cat became a quiet symbol of fragility, of isolation, of the invisible burdens that come with being born into royal expectations. Alexandra never married. She lived quietly, wrote privately, and died without heirs. Her story was largely forgotten by royal historians, perhaps because it didn't fit the tidy mold of legacy and power. But among the marble busts and oil portraits, the soft patter of an unseen feline continues to echo in the footnotes of history. And yet, Alexandra's delusions were harmless, even tender. The next royal rumor, by contrast, is not quite so delicate. An intimate legend that insists one prince carried his burden not in the mind, but somewhere far more awkward. 25. Prince Albert's piercing. There are royal traditions, the waving, the curtsies, the parade of hats at garden parties. And then there are royal rumors, whispered tales so strange, so anatomically specific, that they seem designed solely to test the limits of decorum. One such tale revolves around Prince Albert, the consort of Queen Victoria, and the man largely responsible for dragging the British monarchy into the modern age. He was a reformer, a visionary, a devoted husband, and according to centuries of persistent whispers, the namesake of one of the most infamous body modifications in existence, the Prince Albert piercing. Yes, that one. Now, let's be clear. There is no official record in the royal archives confirming the existence of such a piercing. No medical documents, no diaries, no court physician's note reading. Tuesday, breakfast, fencing, strategic puncture. And yet, the legend refuses to die. According to lore, Prince Albert wore a ring, not in the usual royal places, to help with the fit of his trousers. Victorian fashion, after all, was notoriously unforgiving. Tight trousers were all the rage, and a gentleman's silhouette was expected to be as smooth and symmetrical as his reputation. The theory goes that the piercing allowed Albert to dress to the left or to the right with more precision, keeping things neatly aligned in a society where modesty was theatrical and clothing left little to the imagination. Supposedly, the piercing could be secured by a small hook sewn into the waistband, a kind of aristocratic seatbelt, if you will. But is it true? Historians are skeptical. The earliest mentions of this piercing being named after Prince Albert don't appear until the 1970s, more than a century after his death. The story may have originated with Jim Ward, founder of the modern body piercing movement, who popularized the term and retrofitted it with a historical backstory. It's entirely possible that the whole idea was invented for marketing purposes, then back-justified with Victorian flair. And yet, it feels true. That's what gives the rumor its staying power. Albert was, in many ways, a modern man trapped in a world of dusty wigs and archaic tradition. He championed public education, science, engineering, even toilets. He was also famously attentive to his wife, Queen Victoria, who openly adored him and reportedly had an extremely healthy marital enthusiasm. That detail alone has fueled countless innuendos over the years, often exaggerated by historians desperate to color in the emotional corners of a very buttoned-up era. Whether or not Albert ever wore a royal ring, the myth has become part of his shadow biography, one of those historical side stories that lingers in late-night pub conversations, internet trivia threads, and half-embarrassed museum tours. But if Albert's rumor was all about control and convenience, the next royal tale is the exact opposite, a story of love, exile, and a curse that may have brought down a crown. 26. Edward VIII's cursed abdication. The story of Edward VIII is usually told as a romantic tragedy, a king who gave up his throne for love, a modern-day fairy tale, a man so smitten with Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American, that he chose her over the crown, the empire, and the very institution of monarchy itself. But lurking beneath the tabloids, the glossy headlines, and the stylized Netflix adaptations is a much stranger subplot, one that suggests Edward didn't just abdicate for love. He abdicated under a curse. The story begins long before 1936. Wallis Simpson was already considered scandalous before her affair with the Prince of Wales began. She was American, divorced, outspoken, politically unorthodox. But to certain members of the British aristocracy, and more importantly, the household staff, there was something else, a sense of unease. Rumors began to circulate that she brought bad luck wherever she went. A string of personal misfortunes seemed to follow her, and her arrival in the royal orbit coincided, eerily, with a series of domestic misfires. Staff whispered that she was a jinx, or worse, cursed, a kind of royal Jonah capable of sinking a ship simply by boarding it. Her jewelry was said to have strange properties. One maid allegedly refused to enter her dressing room alone. Footmen reported nightmares. Polished silver went tarnished overnight. Plants died in her presence. These accounts, of course, were never made public, but they lived, like all good curses, in the margins of the royal story. When Edward refused to give up Wallis and instead gave up the crown, many said it was romantic. Others said it was inevitable. But a few, particularly those in the household who had served multiple monarchs, reportedly saw it as the fulfillment of the curse. They whispered that Wallis was never meant to be queen because the monarchy itself would not allow it. That fate, or something more malevolent, intervened. After his abdication, Edward and Wallis were shuffled around Europe, exiled in a gilded kind of irrelevance. He never regained real political influence. He was distrusted by his own family. Wallis became a permanent outsider. Their love endured, yes. But the life they lived was more a warning than a fairy tale. A cautionary tale about what happens when you try to rewrite royal destiny. Even today, when her name is mentioned, it carries a faint air of superstition. Wallis Simpson, The woman who made a king step down and whose presence sent shivers down the spines of royal butlers. Because some say she was just a woman, and others still believe she was a curse in pearls. But while Edward and Wallace were condemned to roam through elegant exile, another royal found joy in building tiny worlds of her own, complete with flushing toilets and working electricity. 27. Queen Mary's dollhouse obsession. Among the stiff portraits, jewel-encrusted crowns, and all the solemn pomp expected of a British royal matriarch, Queen Mary of Teck had a passion so oddly wholesome, and yet strangely obsessive, that it still draws thousands of gawking tourists to Windsor Castle each year. It wasn't jewels or fashion or charity balls. It was a dollhouse. But not just any dollhouse. This was the Queen Mary's doll's house. An astonishing, almost eerie miniature replica of a royal home, complete with flushing toilets, working electricity, wine cellars, miniature books by real authors, and running hot water, all built at a 1/12 scale. It's the largest, most elaborate, and arguably most unnecessarily functional dollhouse ever constructed in human history. And it wasn't built for a child. It was built for a queen. Commissioned in 1921 as a gift for Queen Mary, the wife of King George V, the dollhouse became an obsession. Designed by renowned architect Sir Edwin Lutyens, the project ballooned from a whimsical trinket into a full-blown architectural endeavor. Over 1,500 leading artists, craftsmen, and manufacturers were recruited to contribute. Everything had to be perfect and real. The books in the dollhouse library were written by authors like Rudyard Kipling and J.M. Barrie, penned specifically for dolls. The kitchen was stocked with real miniature food in tiny silver tins. The elevators worked, so did the gramophones. The wine cellar had hundreds of teeny, properly labeled bottles. This wasn't just a dollhouse. It was a shrine to the British Empire, a microcosm of imperial pride built in miniature, and a reflection of Queen Mary's own personality. Meticulous, controlling, and deeply sentimental. She reportedly spent hours admiring it, and even micromanaged the arrangement of furnishings. One servant recalled that the Queen had a gentle, glassy-eyed obsession with the house, gazing at it as if it were the real Windsor, only better because it could be perfect. But beneath the kitschy charm of this shrunken utopia lies something stranger. The eerie notion of a monarch trying to control, to freeze, to encapsulate an ideal version of the world, safe from scandal, chaos, and political change. The dollhouse is beautiful, yes, but it also feels like a mausoleum, a time capsule of a crumbling empire. Queen Mary watched the monarchy stagger through the First World War, her cousin the Tsar murdered, and the rise of modernism encroaching on every royal tradition. The dollhouse, in a sense, was her pushback, a world where the Queen never ages, the sheets never wrinkle, and the servants never complain, and, notably, no abdications ever occur. But while Queen Mary built her perfect world from scale model bricks, one of her royal ancestors was said to return from the grave not to tidy the drapes, but to ride through London in the dead of night pursued by horses that had no heads and, perhaps, no master. 28. George III's ghostly carriage. If you're wandering the streets of London late at night and hear the faint clatter of hooves, don't panic. It's probably just traffic or an early morning delivery van. But for the more supernaturally inclined, there's another possibility. The ghostly carriage of King George I, eternally doomed to ride through the darkness, pulled by a team of headless horses, and occupied by a monarch who never quite found peace in life. Or, apparently, in death. It's one of the stranger ghost stories in British royal folklore, but not without symbolic weight. George I, the first of the Hanoverian kings, ascended the British throne in 1714 after Queen Anne died childless. He was chosen not because he was loved, or even particularly English, but because he was the closest Protestant relative eligible under the Act of Settlement. He spoke barely any English, never connected with the public, and spent much of his reign pining for his homeland. So it's perhaps fitting that his afterlife is reportedly spent wandering, as confused in death as he was in court. According to legend, George's ghost can be seen riding through the streets near St. James's Palace, or even near Whitehall, in a shadowy coach drawn by headless horses. A macabre image that seems pulled straight from Gothic literature. Eyewitnesses over the centuries have described the apparition as chillingly quiet, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. The horses appear, spectral and steaming, their reins jerking as if controlled by an invisible force. Inside the carriage, a lone figure in regal attire, face pale, eyes sunken, silently staring ahead. Of course, ghost carriages are not uncommon in European folklore, but the story of George I is layered with irony. He was a king who never wanted the job. He ascended to the throne of a country he didn't understand, ruled a court that didn't respect him, and died alone and unloved, far from the nation he was supposed to lead. If the crown weighed heavy on anyone, it was George, a man thrust into monarchy by genealogy and trapped there by politics. After his death in 1727, George's remains were shipped back to his native Hanover, buried without much national mourning. The British public barely noticed. His ghost apparently noticed everything. Some say his carriage appears only on anniversaries of great political upheaval. Others claim it's seen whenever there's royal instability, as if George's tortured spirit is drawn to constitutional confusion, forced to ride and re-ride the road between duty and exile. Whether you believe the ghostly coach exists or not, the image sticks. A king in a carriage, pulled by beasts without heads, going nowhere, endlessly. But while George III may be cursed to ride forever through spectral London, one of his successors was very much grounded in earthly pleasures, particularly when it came to his scandalously large family born not in wedlock, but in love or at least enthusiasm with an actress. 29. William IV's illegitimate kids. Before William IV became king of the United Kingdom, he spent decades as the monarchy's most colorful supporting character. A naval officer, a grumpy bachelor, and most notably, a father to at least 10 illegitimate children with a woman he never married. In an era when even a slightly wrinkled royal cravat could trigger a constitutional crisis, William's domestic life was, by comparison, astonishingly casual. His long-term partner? An Irish actress named Dorothea Jordan, with whom he lived for over 20 years, in what was, essentially, a full-blown domestic partnership, minus the church blessing and legal paperwork. Dorothea was witty, talented, and wildly popular on the stage, and William was smitten. He gave her the affectionate nickname Dora, and she gave him what the royal line so often struggled to produce, a large brood of healthy children. The pair had 10 children together between 1794 and 1807, all of whom carried the surname Fitz-Clarence, a nod to William's ducal title, Duke of Clarence. While these children were never eligible for the throne, they were openly acknowledged, financially supported, and even granted noble marriages and titles later in life. William wasn't embarrassed. He was, by most accounts, a surprisingly devoted father, when he remembered their names. The royal court, of course, didn't know what to do with this arrangement. On one hand, William wasn't next in line. Not really. He was the third son of George III and unlikely to ever wear the crown. On the other hand, he was very public about his unconventional family. He had no shame. He and Dorothea lived together in a house in Bushy Park, where visitors were greeted by laughing children and a king-in-waiting more interested in domestic squabbles than political affairs. Eventually, the relationship ended, not with scandal, but with money problems. William's debts piled up, Dorothea's career faded, and the crown began nudging him toward a respectable dynastic marriage. She moved out, Their children were educated and positioned for decent futures, and William married Princess Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen. They had no surviving children, ironically, which meant that the crown passed not to one of William's own blood, but to his niece, Queen Victoria. Even after he became king in 1830, William stayed close to his illegitimate children. He gave his eldest son, George Fitzclarence, the title of Earl of Munster. His daughters married into noble houses. Unlike so many royals who pretended their bastards didn't exist, William promoted his, literally. He saw them as part of his legacy, even if they'd never wear the crown. And therein lies the oddity. A king who never pretended to be pure, who wore his flaws like medals, and his scandals like family crests. For all his bluster, William IV may have been one of the most emotionally honest monarchs Britain ever had. A man who loved an actress, raised 10 children out of wedlock, and ruled a country like it was one big, misbehaving household. But while William filled his royal residences with noise, laughter, and the occasional broken moral expectation, one of his most infamous ancestors left behind something far less charming. A royal palace so foul it could clear a court in minutes. 30. Henry VIII's stinking palaces. When most people think of Henry VIII, they imagine towering portraits, opulent feasts, 6 unlucky wives, and the kind of roaring laugh that echoes down stone corridors. But there's another side to Henry's court that rarely makes it into the textbooks or historical dramas. Namely, the ungodly stench. Because for all his wealth, power, and self-appointed divinity, Henry ruled over palaces that were, by modern standards, barely habitable septic nightmares. Let's start with the basics. Plumbing. There wasn't any. Not in the way we'd recognize today. Henry's palaces, like Hampton Court and Whitehall, were sprawling marvels of Tudor architecture, filled with gilded ceilings, imported tapestries, and intricate wood carvings. And yet, beneath all that grandeur, they were built on a foundation of open cesspits, chamber pots, and overflowing privy channels. These early sewer systems were rarely cleaned and often ran directly beneath the palace grounds, resulting in a constant, nose-curling odor that no amount of incense could mask. One report from the era described Hampton Court in particularly vivid terms. The royal privy was located in a turret, accessible only to the king and select guests. But the waste, gravity being what it is, drained downward, directly under the floors of courtiers and staff. The effect was so pungent that entire wings of the palace were frequently abandoned during hot months, lest guests faint from the fumes. There were even records of outbreaks of illness blamed not on foreign enemies, but on foul airs rising from the king's own floors. And then there was the Groom of the Stool, a real title, held by a real person, whose entire job was to oversee the king's toilet habits. Henry VIII had a custom-built, velvet-covered commode, and the unfortunate noble who served as groom was responsible not just for assisting, but for recording bowel movements in a logbook. This position, oddly enough, was considered prestigious, since it gave the groom unparalleled access to the monarch. You could rise in court politics by being really, really good at toilet diplomacy. The irony, of course, is that Henry was obsessed with control. He micromanaged his court, his image, his wives, and his heirs. Yet the very palaces he built, symbols of dominance and divine rule, were full of rot, decay, and the inescapable smell of human waste. Even the gardens, designed to impress visiting ambassadors and rivals, were edged with moats that doubled as open-air sewers. Walks through the rose beds were best taken with a handkerchief to the nose and a strong stomach. But perhaps that's the perfect metaphor for Henry's reign. Brilliant on the outside, rotting underneath. A king obsessed with image, while his empire quietly fermented from within. And still, centuries later, the royal obsession with refinement and modernity continues. Sometimes in grand architecture, sometimes in global diplomacy, and sometimes in plastic food containers. 31. Queen Elizabeth II's Tupperware. One of the most fascinating things about Queen Elizabeth II, the woman who navigated the monarchy through 7 decades of geopolitical upheaval, family scandal, and global transformation, was how relentlessly practical she remained. No matter how golden the carriages, how priceless the tiaras, or how scripted the public appearances, she always retained a core of frugal, country-bred common sense that often clashed amusingly with her diamond-draped image. And nowhere was that contradiction more evident than at the palace dinner table, specifically in her unexpected devotion to a very non-royal material, Tupperware. Yes, Her Majesty used plastic containers at Buckingham Palace. The idea of a monarch who owns diamond brooches the size of dinner plates choosing to store leftovers in pastel-colored, click-sealed bowls may sound like an internet joke. But multiple sources, including former royal chefs and staff, have confirmed it. Queen Elizabeth II didn't just tolerate Tupperware, she reportedly insisted on it, particularly during informal family meals or when staying at her beloved country retreat, Balmoral Castle. According to royal chef Darren McGrady, who cooked for the Queen for over a decade, informal meals often involve dishes being brought out not on silver platters, but in Tupperware containers, especially during picnics or in front of the TV. And the Queen? She loved it. She saw no contradiction between monarchy and modesty. In her view, wasting food was far more scandalous than storing it in plastic. This wasn't performative humility. It was simply how she was raised. Before she was queen, Elizabeth grew up during World War II, when rationing shaped the national psyche. She learned to value utility, to make do, to reuse. Even as sovereign, she famously kept rooms cold to save energy, reused wrapping paper, and recycled clothes in her wardrobe, sometimes decades after their first public outing. And the Tupperware? It wasn't hidden away in some back kitchen. Staff have said that during casual lunches, they'd see the Queen happily lifting lids and helping herself. Guests, even titled ones, were often surprised to find themselves scooping from the same kind of container you'd find at a suburban barbecue. There's something deeply British about it. The quiet absurdity of a queen who could dine on gold-rimmed china choosing instead a plastic bowl with a stubborn lid. It speaks not just to Elizabeth's personality, but to the surreal contradictions embedded in monarchy itself, the performance of wealth beside the rituals of thrift, the crown atop the casserole, and yet that odd image of the Queen hunched over a table with a spoon in one hand and a Tupperware lid in the other, humanized her in ways decades of public relations never could. It was one of those small, whispered truths that didn't undermine her image, but made it oddly believable. Because in a palace where everything is polished, curated, and ceremonial, the most royal thing of all may be choosing not to perform royalty at all. But while Elizabeth's reign included the hum of refrigerators and plastic containers, one of her predecessors had a household companion of a very different sort, a foul-mouthed parrot who shocked the court and outlived his king. 32. George V's parrot. For a monarch known for his stern mustache, love of naval uniforms, and relatively no-nonsense approach to kingship, George V had an unexpectedly colorful companion, a parrot, and not just any parrot. According to palace whispers and a few rather astonished footmen, the bird had a vocabulary that would make a sailor blush, and apparently delivered its lines in multiple languages. Yes, the King of England, Emperor of India, and Defender of the Faith had a foul-mouthed polyglot parrot living under his roof. It's hard to say exactly when the parrot came into George's possession, but by most accounts, it was during his later years, the 1920s and early 1930s. The bird, likely an African gray, notorious for their intelligence and capacity to mimic human speech, became a minor character at court, often shocking guests by reciting profanities and insults in what was described as a suspiciously accurate imitation of certain members of Parliament. Whether the bird was trained intentionally or simply picked up its phrases from servants is unclear, though one suspects the palace kitchens were fertile ground for spicy language. George, for his part, was said to find the parrot hilarious. In public, he was all grim dignity and imperial weight. In private, he apparently egged the bird on, laughing whenever it interrupted meetings or muttered inappropriate commentary during tea. One popular tale, perhaps apocryphal, but far too good to fact-check, describes the parrot being present during a small diplomatic lunch. As the French ambassador was about to make a polite toast, the bird reportedly shouted, "Pas maintenant, imbécile!" "Not now, idiot!" The ambassador blinked, paused, and then continued as if nothing had happened. George V reportedly choked on his tea from laughter. The bird became something of a palace legend. Beloved by some, feared by others. It wasn't allowed at official dinners, but it had the run of the royal study. Staff occasionally found it perched on thrones or muttering to itself in dark corners. One visitor described it as the only thing in the palace that speaks freely. There's no record of what happened to the parrot after George V's death in 1936. Some say it was passed on to a favored footman. Others believe it was quietly retired, though whether that meant moved to an aviary or sent off to join the Queen's corgis in the afterlife is anyone's guess. But perhaps the parrot was more than a pet. Maybe it was a release valve, a way for a deeply restrained monarch to enjoy a tiny pocket of anarchy within a life of ceremonial suffocation. Still, even parrots eventually go silent. Which brings us to something much quieter and much more curious, the strange, sweetly absurd world of royal nicknames, where the most powerful people in Britain called each other things like Cabbage, Margot, and Old P. 33. Royal family nicknames. For a family built on formality, nothing quite disrupts the illusion like a nickname. You can craft a monarchy from marble and ritual, wrap it in ermine, and announce its every movement with trumpets. But the moment someone calls the monarch Lilibet, the entire illusion wobbles. Which is exactly what makes royal family nicknames so bizarre, so charming, and so deeply revealing. Let's start with Queen Elizabeth II herself, affectionately known as Lilibet, since childhood. The name came from her own mispronunciation of Elizabeth when she was very young, and it stuck. Her parents used it, her sister used it, Prince Philip used it. Even on the wreath at her funeral, the card from King Charles III was signed, "In loving and devoted memory, Charles R." Addressed simply to Lilibet. The name, innocent and intimate, stood in perfect contrast to the grandeur of her title, Queen of the United Kingdom and 15 other realms. Her husband, Prince Philip, was known in turn by a range of nicknames. The Queen often called him Old P, or Darling, while he referred to her, famously and cryptically, as Cabbage. The origin of this particular term of endearment remains delightfully unclear. Some say it comes from the French mon petit chou, my little cabbage, a common affectionate phrase. Others suspect it was entirely Philip's invention, which somehow makes more sense. Then there's Princess Margaret, the younger sister with a flair for drama and defiance. Within the family, she often referred to herself as Margot, a tongue-in-cheek performance of aristocratic self-parody. When imitating herself, she'd adopt a mock theatrical voice and say, "Oh, Margot, darling," as though she were playing a role, which arguably she was. Even Prince Charles, now king, was known to call the Queen Mummy well into his 70s, sometimes to the visible discomfort of audiences at public events. And his own sons, William and Harry, had their share of monikers too. William was said to be called Wombat as a child, an Australian nickname gifted during a royal tour. And Harry was often referred to as Spike by close friends, though now his public image is split between Duke of Sussex and the one who moved to California. The nicknames might seem trivial, but they expose something fascinating: the emotional loopholes inside an institution built on stoicism. when titles define your entire identity, when even your first name is swallowed by ceremonial weight, nicknames become survival tools. They remind these ultra-public figures that somewhere, beneath the crowns and coats of arms, there's still a son, a wife, a sister. There's still a Lilibet, or a Cabbage. Because in the end, the British monarchy is not just a political relic. It's a family. Dysfunctional, absurd, mythologized, and strangely human. And in a way, that's the most mysterious part of all.